Hello, creative photographers. I'm Hayley from Creative Photo Folk, back from my 3 months break. So I hope you're ready to dive into even more creative photography tricks and techniques. In today's project, we're going to use intentional camera movement, otherwise known as ICM, to photograph flowers. ICM is a technique where you deliberately move your camera during a long exposure to blur your subject, which creates painterly abstract images. This is a wonderful technique for recovering perfectionists or anyone who's lost their mojo, because the results are completely unpredictable. While you can shoot just about anything with ICM, today we'll be experimenting with everyone's first favourite subject, plants and flowers. We're going to start outdoors in the garden and then head into my home studio to see what we can create. So first things first, if we're shooting outdoors on a sunny day, it's going to be difficult to use long exposures without blowing out the highlights. So you'll need to either shoot early morning, late afternoon, or wait until you have an overcast day when there's less light. People seem to think there's some magical formula for creating good ICM. So to test this, I spent 10 minutes wandering around my garden, which is honestly pretty boring, to prove that anyone can create artistic images in whatever time you can spare. There's no exact science to this, and if there was, I suspect it would take away some of the fun. So I started first with a 24-70 lens, but found the wider framing included too many background distractions. So after swapping to my 100mm macro lens, I started getting results I liked a lot more, because I was able to get closer and fill my frame with the subject. When deciding what subjects to photograph, I was mainly looking for areas of contrast, so light and shade or a variety of colours. I like the look of larger leaves that I could sweep my camera across, or small detailed leaves and clumps of grasses for interesting patterns. Try and avoid plants with imperfections because these will show up, and crop out distracting detail in the background like bricks, fences, or the sky, unless you can blur them into obscurity. Also make sure you clean your lens because dust spots really seem to show up on blurry photos. I seem to get the best results between 0.3 and 0.6 of a second, with more movement than less. This was just enough to create interesting blur, while still being able to kind of make out what the subject was. My ISO was as low as I could get it, and my aperture sat at around f/22. When you find a subject that you like the look of, make sure to stick around and perfect it rather than wandering on to the next spot straight away. This is how you'll get the best results. Now, because you're shooting in flat lighting, you will need to do some post to your images to bring out the colors and detail. So let's head over there now. So let's start out with my favorite image from the shoot, which was a couple of chilies that were actually growing through the fence from next door. And so this is the after photo after I've done the editing. So let me now show you the before photo, which looked like this. So you can see it's very, very dull. You know, the exposure's okay, but because of that overcast lighting, it's pretty dull. So let me show you what I did in editing. So I did experiment with the color temperature just a tiny bit with this. So I didn't with most of my images. So I'm actually just going to skip over that. But I brought up my exposure a tiny amount. Contrast is up a little bit, so that's what it looked like without contrast, and arguably it's just as good. Highlights didn't do a whole lot. It was just really dragging down some of the harshness of the background, the fence that was in the background, lighter fence. Shadows was just bringing up this area here, giving a little bit more detail. I brought up the whites quite a lot in most of these images, so that's before the whites and that's after, so that really makes those colors pop. And same with blacks, so that's before. Yeah, arguably that's okay, but I like my images with a little more contrast, so that's after I've added the blacks. Added just a tiny bit of texture. I pretty much never add texture to an image, but I did a little bit with this one. Clarity, so that's before and after. Again, personal taste, just brings out that contrast a little bit more again. And I did bring up the vibrance quite a bit, before and after. Otherwise, I did not do very much more. I think I did do a little bit of sharpening. Oh, I didn't, so ignore that. I did on some images. And then for the effects, I did add a little bit of a vignette, so that's before and after. So that really just directs the eye to the center. Personal taste, I do that for most of my images. And so we'll just have a look at one more. Might go for something really simple like these leaves. So this is after, that's before. So again, you really do need to do some work to these to get them to pop, but this is just to show you that you will need to do some editing to get a bit more richness out of your results. If you don't have a well-trained eye yet, it can be kind of hard to tell which of your photos are good. So you might need to post a few on socials and just kind of gauge what reaction they get. I got about 5 photos I'd be happy to share out of around 100. I recommend culling heavily because this can be addictive and will clog up your hard drive really quickly. Now we're going to head into the studio to see what we can achieve in a different environment. Now, because we'll be using long exposures to capture movement, you'll need a fully dark room to prevent seeing any objects in the background. You'll also need a light source to light up your subject. I started off using a butterfly light, but it died halfway through, never to be revived. So I swapped to using a directional lamp that I bought from Aldi, which was much easier to rotate into the positions I needed. I clamped this onto my shelves and covered it with some greaseproof paper to make it a little bit more diffuse. I set up a black backdrop behind, which you may not find necessary, but because I was shooting during the day, there was some light leaking in from outside, and my lamp was lighting up some of the room behind. So rather than trying to block all these areas, I figured it was just easier to use a backdrop. I set this up at some distance behind to prevent my light from hitting it. You could also build some kind of directional snoot to stop your light from spilling around. Obviously, you'll need some flowers. I have a very sparse garden and no funds to buy flowers, but I do have lots of fake flowers that I figured would be okay. Sadly, you can obviously tell they are fake, so I don't recommend doing that. I also included a few things from the garden, like leaves and dead flowers. Any flower will do, but I recommend trying lots of different types. I found the more detailed the flowers were, the more chaotic the results. Next, you'll need a table to put them on, and a way to support your flowers. As I had a variety of different sizes and shapes, I grabbed a variety of different size vases. And when I didn't have one large enough, I used an empty postage tube. We are all about getting creative after all. And then it was just a matter of shooting the flowers. The settings I used were mainly between 2 to 5 seconds with an ISO of 100, and I varied the aperture a lot between f8 to f16 because darker flowers needed more light and because I was experimenting with lots of different movements. It will really also depend how close and bright your light source is. My tip would be to start with f10 and about 2 seconds and then review your results and adjust from there. I always made sure to focus on the flowers because even though the results might be blurry, I still like to give the eye a place to go. Now, I experimented with 3 different types of movements. So they were handheld, which made my image completely blurry, keeping the camera still with a tripod and moving the flowers, but I did have to be careful about not being caught in shot, and then on a tripod but moving the camera. So I loosened the bolts on my tripod and moved the camera around. The tighter the bolts were, the jerkier the movements, which is not the worst thing, it just gave a different look. I wanted to try something different here. So in most of my shots, I held the camera still for part of the exposure to burn the flower in, and then I did my movements. So I did some where I held the camera still first and then moved after, which showed the blur over the still image. And then some where I moved the camera first and then held it still, which burnt in the still image over the blur. If you're familiar with a rear curtain sync, it's the same kind of concept, but that is pretty advanced, so don't worry if you don't know what that is. It's not necessary to understand. For my movements, I found slow, long movements worked best because they picked up more light. But I don't want to be too specific with my advice because this is all part of the fun of experimenting. So you can try twisting, zooming, moving side to side, up, down, and all around, swishing, long versus short movements, varying your shutter speed, and including several pauses in your movements. I took about 500 images to get 40 or so that I don't hate. Now, there is a second way to do this technique that will give you much more impressive results, and that's by using slow speed sync, which combines a flash to freeze your subject and then a constant light to capture the movement during the long exposure. But because not everyone has the gear, I wanted to demonstrate the zero budget method. But if you want to try a more advanced method, this is a technique I teach inside my course Photo Fanatics. So to show you what I mean, this is a model, not a flower, but it was taken using the same method we use today, except instead of holding my camera partly still during the exposure, I used a flash to freeze the subject and then added some colored gels to my constant light. Finally, let's just quickly jump into editing and I'll show you what I did to enhance my results. So with our in-studio images, here is a after. Let's take a look at a before. So I don't mind the before actually, you probably even prefer it a little bit more. But I just wanted to show you what I did. So basically brought down the exposure a little bit because that light was a little bit just too hot. Brought up the contrast quite a lot, which, you know what, I'm actually going to leave that off. Highlights, again, just brought a little bit of, because the eye is now popping here and I really want it here, so I just dragged down those highlights a little bit. Shadows I've lifted to get some more ICM detail, so you'll see what that does. Whites I have lifted quite a bit just again to make this pop, and blacks I've brought down. Again, I kind of prefer it without it. This is the difference between editing at night and now I'm in the daytime, so I can see a little bit differently. Clarity I've just popped a tiny bit, and vibrance I have lifted just to give a bit more of that green and yellow to come out. So not really huge changes, but there is a little bit of work that I did to just enhance the effect. Now, one other thing I did, which I've seen other people do, so I thought, hey, I'm going to give that a go, is to create these inversions. Let me show you how I did that. So that was this image here, and what I had to do is open it in Photoshop. So I right-clicked, edit in Adobe Photoshop. Just to keep a reference file, I have made a copy, so I press Ctrl or Command J just to make a copy of that background layer. Then what I did is press Ctrl or Command I, and that inverts it, so it makes a kind of reverse version of it. It makes the blacks white and the whites blacks, and kind of does the opposite of any color that's in it as well. You know, you might like that, but I thought the black and white looked a little bit better, so then I went to my adjustment layers, added a black and white adjustment. Now I could have left it there, but see, there must be a little bit of noise in this image. So see how it's got this kind of grainy weirdness going on? I didn't like that. So I started to play with the black and white sliders. Let me drag this down so we can see them. So you can actually move them around to change how things look. I didn't like moving the reds. It made that problem worse. Yellows. Again, that's just making that problem worse, but I could add it a little bit more softly. So that's maybe helping the problem just there. Some greens, I don't think there are any greens. Cyans, that does quite a lot. So I leave that there. Blues, yuck, maybe about there. And magentas are only affecting the bottom. So you can just use that to create an image to your taste. And then I probably added levels just to try and fix this problem and brought those highlights up. So now that noise is gone. So that's a little fix there. And then I could play with the other tones, like really bring out the blacks. I'm not loving this, but I could clone it out if I wanted. And so that's something different you can do with your ICM images. And that, my creative friends, is how you can make photography art right now with no special skills or expensive gear. So go outside and smell the roses and create some wonderful sellable art while you're there. But first, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again next week. Happy creating!